People will tell you that love is a feeling. They're wrong mostly, or they're describing a small part of the thing and mistaking it for the whole. What I came to understand, not in a church pew, not from a book, but standing in my mother's kitchen at 6 in the morning watching her fry eggs in a cast-iron skillet, is that love is a practice. It is a repeated, daily, unglamorous act of showing up. You can feel whatever you like about someone. The question that actually matters is whether you are still there when it is inconvenient. My mother, Ruth Ann Calloway, showed up for 61 years of my life without ever once describing it as sacrifice. She was born in 1945 in a small house in Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, the daughter of a hardware store owner and a woman who taught Sunday school until she was 91 and corrected your grammar while she did it. Ruth grew up knowing how to hem a dress, balance a ledger, and say uncomfortable truths without raising her voice. She married my father at 22, had me at 23, lost him to a heart attack at 54, and kept going without what I would call visible hesitation. She would have said she didn't have time for hesitation. She would have been telling the truth. The cast-iron skillet she cooked with every Sunday morning was something she bought herself in 1971 at a hardware store going out of business. She paid $4.75 for it. She told me that story every year as if it were the first time, and every year I acted like I hadn't heard it because she loved telling it and it cost me nothing to let her. That skillet sat on the back left burner of every stove she ever owned. It was seasoned the color of midnight. She said a skillet like that takes 20 years to get right and another 20 to appreciate. She was not wrong about that, the way she was not wrong about most things. She called me her oldest friend, which was technically true. I'd known her longer than anyone alive, and also the kind of compliment that gets better the older you get, because by 61 you understand what friendship actually costs. I was born the year she learned to drive. She told me I came home from the hospital on the same day she finally parallel parked without hitting anything. She said she considered it a good omen. 2 things she'd worked hard at finally working. She made my wedding dress by hand, not the whole dress, the sleeves and the bodice, because I found the skirt at a sample sale and couldn't afford to alter it without ruining it. She sat at her kitchen table with her reading lamp and her thimble for 3 weeks and did the sleeves herself by hand in a pattern she drew from memory. She didn't tell Douglas this. She didn't think it was his business, she said. Some things are between a mother and her daughter. I thought she meant the dress. She stayed with us when I had my gallbladder out in 2019, not to be helpful in the performative sense, not to arrange flowers or run errands. She stayed because she knew I got frightened in the night post-surgery and that Douglas slept through most things and that someone should be awake in case I needed something. She slept on our pull-out couch for 4 nights, 63 years old, without complaint, and every morning she made eggs in the skillet she'd brought from home in a padded bag like it was an infant. She said a hospital-adjacent kitchen was no place for a non-stick pan. I knit through those 4 nights in the chair beside the pullout because knitting is how I stay calm when I cannot control what is happening in a room. I had been working on a cable knit cardigan in sage green. I'd started it in October and I was on the 2nd sleeve. Ruth looked at my progress in the lamplight and said, "That's for you. I hope you never make things for yourself." I said it was for her, actually for her birthday. She said, "Make the next one for yourself." She said it the way she said everything important once clearly, and then she moved on. In March of last year, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me calmly that the doctor had found something. She did not dramatize it. She had gone to Erlanger Health System for a routine appointment and Dr. Susan Park had ordered imaging, and the imaging had come back with news that required a conversation. She had that conversation. She called me afterward. She told me it was stage 3 ovarian cancer and that Dr. Park had already outlined a treatment plan and that she had already asked the important questions and written down the answers. She said, "I need you to know not to panic, there's a difference." I took 3 seconds and said, "I know." I drove to Chattanooga the next morning. I did not go home for 11 weeks. It was a Saturday, August 23rd. My mother had been in treatment for 5 months. The first 2 rounds of chemotherapy had gone as well as Dr. Park had hoped, which meant they had gone hard and had required management and had taken things from my mother that she was gracious about losing, her hair among them. which she handled by going to a wig shop on Market Street and selecting something close to her natural color and wearing it with the same posture she wore everything. The third round had been more difficult. By August she was thinner than I had ever seen her, and her appetite came and went like weather, and the apartment on Scenic Highway smelled of the specific medicinal air of a place where illness has settled in. I had been sleeping in her second bedroom. I had been doing her grocery shopping, managing her medications, 7 prescriptions, organized in a weekly pill organizer I labeled myself, driving her to Erlanger 3 times a week, cooking whatever she could stand to eat, and knitting in the evenings while she slept because the knitting kept my hands occupied and my mind from going to places that weren't useful. The sage green cardigan was finished by then. I'd started a blanket in cream wool for no reason except that I needed something large and time-consuming. Douglas had come to visit twice in 5 months. The first visit was in April for a weekend. He brought wine which my mother could not drink and flowers which were kind but which needed tending that I did not have time for. He left on Sunday afternoon. He said he had an early meeting Monday. The second visit was in June, 3 days. He spent a portion of the second day on work calls in the parking lot. He left Thursday morning. He said the drive was hard on him. I had been noticing things the way you notice a smell that shouldn't be there, gradually and then with certainty. The credit card statement that came in July had charges from a restaurant I didn't recognize. On evenings I knew I wasn't home more than once. A notification on the shared cloud account which Douglas had forgotten we shared showed photographs I was not in and was not meant to see. A name, Joanna Price. A colleague he had mentioned once, weeks before, casually, as people mention things they are testing to see if you react to. I had not reacted, I had filed it. On August 23rd, my mother had a difficult night. By 7:00 in the morning she had a fever of 101.4 and was experiencing nausea that Dr. Park's on-call line said warranted an ER visit for hydration and evaluation. I needed help getting her to the car. She weighed 112 pounds, but she was dizzy and I was afraid to move her alone. I called Douglas at 7:18 in the morning. The phone rang 4 times and he answered with the voice of someone who had not just woken up. There was in the background a sound, music, faint, a morning radio station, and the quality of the ambient sound was not the quality of our bedroom. It was a room I did not recognize by its acoustics. I told him what was happening. I told him I needed him. I said, I can't move her safely by myself. I need you here. He said, Diane, I'm 3 hours away. I said, I know. I need you here. He was quiet for 4 seconds. He said, call a neighbor or the non-emergency line. You don't need me specifically for this. I heard the music in the background. I said, Douglas. He said, I'll check in later. Let me know how she does. The call ended at 7:23. I stood in the kitchen of my mother's apartment and held the phone and looked at the cast iron skillet on the back left burner, the one she'd bought for $4.75 in 1971, the one that had cooked 50 years of Sunday breakfasts, and I was very, very clear about what I was doing next. I called Vivian. Vivian Oates has been my closest friend since 1997. We met at a school fundraiser, both of us standing at the dessert table, both of us pretending we weren't about to take a second brownie, and had been inseparable in the way that adult women can be inseparable, which is less dramatic than it sounds and more sustaining than anyone gives it credit for. She is 59, recently retired from teaching high school English, and she drives a sensible dark green Subaru that always has a canvas tote in the back seat full of library books she's returning or picking up or somehow both. She had been up to Chattanooga to see my mother 3 times during the illness, each time bringing something practical, a thermal blanket, specific soup, a large print puzzle book Ruth had not asked for and immediately loved. I called her at 7:24 in the morning. I said, Vivian, it's me. Mom needs the ER. I can't move her safely alone and Douglas isn't coming. She said, I'm already putting on shoes. 8 words. She lived 22 minutes away on a Saturday morning with no traffic. She was at my mother's door in 19 minutes. She was wearing her coat over her pajama top and she had not, as far as I could tell, stopped to do anything except put on shoes and get her keys, which was exactly right. She helped me get my mother to the car with the kind of steady, wordless competence that is the exclusive territory of people who genuinely love someone and are not performing it. She held Ruth's arm. She did not make her feel fragile. She said to my mother very simply, We've got you, Ruth, you're all right. My mother said, eyes closed, leaning slightly, "Vivian, you didn't have to." Vivian said, "Don't insult me, Ruth." My mother made a sound that was almost a laugh. Vivian drove. She knew where Erlanger was. She'd been before with me in June. She had a water bottle and a granola bar from her canvas tote that she pressed into my hand without asking if I wanted it because she knew I had not eaten. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and she did not ask me a single question about Douglas because she is the kind of woman who knows which questions to hold until later and which ones to hold forever. We arrived at Erlanger Health System at 8:09 in the morning. Vivian parked and walked in beside me and sat down in the waiting area with her library book and stayed for 7 hours. The waiting room at Erlanger's oncology emergency intake is different from a regular ER waiting room, and the difference is a kind of quiet wait. The people sitting in it are not there with broken things that will be fixed. They are there managing something ongoing, something that has settled into a long and complicated residency. The chairs are the same plastic. The lights are the same fluorescent hum. The vending machine in the corner took dollar bills and offered things in primary colors that no one in the room looked at. The television in the corner was playing a home renovation program on mute, a before and after that kept cycling without sound, and I watched it for a while without seeing it. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air and faintly of the hand sanitizer mounted every 12 feet along the walls. I sat in the second row of chairs with my knitting. I had grabbed it on the way out, the cream wool blanket, half finished because my hands needed something and because my mother would have approved. I did not knit well in the waiting room. I dropped a stitch twice and did not bother fixing it. But I held the needles and the wool, and that was its own form of anchoring. At 9:31, Dr. Susan Park appeared, which surprised me. She was my mother's oncologist, not the ER physician, but she had been called and she had come in on a Saturday morning without, apparently, treating this as an imposition. She was a small woman with precise posture and dark hair pulled back and the kind of calm that is not distance, it is presence, controlled. She shook my hand and said, "Your mother is stable, the fever is responding to fluids. We're going to keep her for observation and I want to adjust one of her medications while we have her." I said, "Thank you for coming in." She said, "Of course," as if it were not a Saturday. As if it were simply the job which I understood to her it was. The overnight nurse assigned to my mother's room was Thomas Grady, late 30s, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken in the way that large people sometimes are, as if they've learned that size is already a presence and the voice doesn't need to add to it. He had a small enamel pin on his lanyard, a tiny orange cat. When I noticed it, he said, without me asking, "My daughter picked it, she's 7, she gives me one every Christmas." He said it with the plainness of someone for whom love is not embarrassing, which I found immediately steadying. He brought my mother water. He adjusted her blankets without making a production of it. He explained the medication change in terms that assumed she was intelligent, which she was and which she noticed and appreciated. My mother was awake and alert by 11:00. She looked at me in the chair beside her bed, the knitting in my lap, the cream wool catching the fluorescent light, and she said, "That's not going to be straight." I said, "I dropped 2 stitches. She said, "I can fix those." I said, "I know you can." She held out her hand. I gave her the knitting. She found the dropped stitches without her glasses and began working them back in with the needle she held between 2 fingers like a pen, the way she always did with the ease of 60 years of practice. At 12:19 I checked my phone. Douglas had sent one text. It arrived at 10:47 a.m. It said, "How is she?" 3 words, 3 hours after I'd called him. No call, no follow-up, 1 text. I set the phone face down on my knee and I looked at my mother's hands working the knitting needles and I thought, I have been here before, not in this hospital, in this moment of understanding. I had been circling it for 2 years, maybe longer, the way you circle a decision you already know you've made without yet admitting you've made it. I looked at the dropped stitches being worked back in with such steady, certain hands. Then I picked up my phone. I did not text Douglas back. I opened my contacts and I found Arthur Finch's number. If you have been watching for a while, do us one quick favor, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Now let me tell you what happened next. I did not call Arthur Finch that day, not because I wasn't ready, I was ready. I waited because my mother needed me present and I was not going to give half my attention to either thing. When I make a decision, I make it completely. That is another thing she taught me without calling it a lesson. My mother was discharged on Monday, August 25th at 2:30 in the afternoon. Thomas Grady walked us to the elevator. He told my mother she'd been a model patient. She told him the enamel cat pin was a good choice. He smiled and said his daughter would be glad to hear it. I got my mother settled at home by 4:00. I made her soup from what was in the refrigerator, not as good as hers, never as good, and I sat with her while she ate, and by 6. She was asleep and I was at the kitchen table. I called Arthur Finch at 6:17 p.m. Arthur Finch of Finch and Hollander is 64 years old and has been practicing estate law in Chattanooga for 37 years. I found him through my accountant, who found him necessary once during her own divorce proceedings and said he was the sharpest and least dramatic attorney she'd ever met, which were the two qualities I required. He had drawn up my mother's will the previous November. That was my introduction to him, and I had kept his card. I had also, at that November appointment, asked him a few questions that were not about my mother's will. They were about my own situation, what I owned, what I could protect, what the process looked like if things went in a particular direction. I had not retained him then, I had just needed to understand the terrain. Arthur Finch answered at 6:19. I told him who I was, he remembered. I said I was ready to retain him and that I'd like to begin as soon as possible. He said he had an opening Thursday morning at 8:00 before his regular calendar started. I said I'd be there. I spent the next 2 evenings after my mother slept going through documents at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the house quiet. I am thorough by nature, and the past months of managing my mother's medical paperwork had sharpened the skill considerably. I knew where everything was. I had always known where everything was because in our marriage I was the one who knew where everything was. Douglas had relied on this without thinking about it, the way people rely on a well-maintained road without thinking about the maintenance. I pulled together. The deed to the house on Birchwood Terrace, which Douglas and I had purchased in 2008 with $95,000 from my personal savings account. Money I had been building since before we married, from my own income documented separately from our joint accounts. The mortgage had been in both names, but the down payment history was clear. The investment account Douglas believed was primarily his contribution. In fact, for 9 of the 14 years we'd been invested, my salary had outpaced his. I knew the numbers because I did the taxes, the joint checking account, the joint savings, his pension beneficiary designation, which still listed me and which I had every legal right to address from my side, and then the other thing. The thing I had discovered 6 weeks earlier, quietly, while managing the cloud account Douglas had forgotten we shared. Douglas had been paying rent. Not our mortgage, a separate payment, $1,850 a month to an address on Missionary Ridge which I looked up and which was an apartment building. He had been paying this for at least 7 months, as far back as the statements I could access. A second residence, for Joanna Price, whose name I had found in photographs I was not meant to see, with a date stamp that went back 10 months. 7 months of rent, $12,950 from our joint account to a woman I had never officially been introduced to, paid in the months I was caring for my dying mother 60 miles away. I wrote the figure down in my notebook. I wrote it clearly, $12,950. I put a circle around it, not from anger but because specific numbers are the language that lawyers in courts find most useful, and I was preparing a document, not a grievance. I put the notebook in the accordion folder. I went to check on my mother. She was asleep with the cream wool blanket pulled over her, the one I'd brought from the hospital, the one she'd fixed the dropped stitches in. She had her hand on top of it like she was keeping it warm. I stood in the doorway for a moment and then I went back to the kitchen and I finished the rest of what I needed to do. Vivian came by on Wednesday evening with dinner, a whole roasted chicken and vegetables, enough for 2 days, and she sat with my mother while I showered and changed, and for the first time in several weeks felt like a person with a plan rather than a person in a crisis. There is a specific kind of calm that comes from having decided, not happiness, not relief exactly, just the absence of the static that fills the space between knowing what you should do and actually doing it. The static was gone. Before I go on, if this story is hitting close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button while you're at it. Now, back to what I was saying. Arthur Finch's office is on the 4th floor of a building on Georgia Avenue with a view of the Tennessee River and the kind of quiet that only exists in places where serious work is done seriously. He has no plants. He says he doesn't trust himself with them, but there are framed topographic maps on the walls of the Appalachian Range that run through Tennessee, and they give the room a grounded, unhurried feeling. He is a tall man with the deliberate posture of someone who played college basketball and never entirely stopped. He shook my hand on Thursday morning at 7:58 and said, "You brought documents." I set the accordion folder on his desk. He said, "Good, let's start from the beginning." We were there for 3 hours and 11 minutes. This is what changed, specifically and permanently, and I will tell you exactly because I believe the details matter and vagueness is a form of softness I have no use for. The house on Birchwood Terrace, a 4-bedroom property on a quiet street in North Chattanooga, appraised most recently at $478,000. The original down payment, $95,000 from my personal premarital savings account, documented by bank statements going back to 2007, was established in the record. Arthur said the retitling was not only possible but straightforward given the documentation. Within 60 days, the property was retitled solely in my name, the joint investment account which held $214,000. My demonstrated contribution over 14 years was a matter of tax record. Arthur identified my traceable portion at $127,000. That amount was transferred to an individual account in my name only, at an institution Douglas had no affiliation with. The joint checking account held $38,400. My half, $19,200, was moved to the same new individual account, effective immediately upon filing. The $12,950 paid from joint funds to the Missionary Ridge apartment over 7 months was documented and submitted as dissipation of marital assets, which is what the law calls it when a spouse uses shared money to fund a relationship they are conducting behind the other spouse's back. Arthur said this figure would factor into any subsequent settlement with interest. He said it without editorializing. That is what I paid him for. My beneficiary designations, life insurance, retirement accounts, personal savings were updated immediately. Douglas Wayne Mercer's name was removed from every instrument. My mother, Ruth Ann Calloway, was added as primary beneficiary on all accounts. A secondary beneficiary, the Hospice of Chattanooga Volunteer Fund, was designated on the retirement account. My mother had benefited from hospice volunteers during her treatment. This was not symbolic, it was accurate. The cast-iron skillet, Ruth's skillet, the one bought for $4.75 in 1971, the one that had lived in my kitchen for the past 3 years because she'd given it to me when she downsized, was photographed and documented as personal property predating the marriage, gifted by a family member. Its provenance was established. It was never Douglas's, but some things need to be written down anyway. Douglas's name appeared in none of the revised documents except as the party being removed. In every new instrument, every retitled deed, every updated designation, his name appeared exactly 0 times. Arthur Finch closed the folder at 11:09 Thursday morning and looked at me over the desk. He said, "In 37 years, I have rarely seen anyone walk in here as prepared as you were." I said I had time to think. I was away from home for 11 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm sorry about your mother." I said, "She's still here." He said, "I know, I just meant I'm sorry for what this time has asked of you." I thanked him and I meant it. Douglas found out on a Friday, not because I told him. Because the automatic payment he'd set up for the joint account, a payment to the Missionary Ridge apartment, declined on the 1st of September when the joint account balance dropped to the level it reached after my transfer. The notification went to his phone. He called the bank. The bank told him what the account held. He called me at 4:44 in the afternoon. I was at my mother's kitchen table. She was asleep in the next room. I had the knitting in my lap, a new project, started the week before, a simple ribbed scarf in charcoal wool, and the lamp was on, and it was the quiet part of the late afternoon that I had come to think of as mine. I answered on the second ring. He said, "Diane, what did you do to the account?" I said, "I protected what was mine." There was a silence. The quality of it was different from his usual silences, not the silence of someone who doesn't think the question merits an answer, but the silence of someone recalibrating quickly, trying to find the angle. He said, "I don't understand what that means. The house," I called the county records office and they said the deed has been. He stopped, started again. "You red-idled the house." I said nothing. He said, "Diane, we need to talk about this. All of this, whatever you think you found, whatever this is." I said, "I didn't find anything I wasn't already looking for." Another silence longer. I could hear him breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the thing it usually carried, the low-grade confidence of a man who has operated for years inside a story he wrote himself and never expected anyone to edit. He said, "The Missionary Ridge thing, that's not what you're thinking. It was for storage, for work equipment, and I should have told you. I know I should have." I set down the knitting. He kept going. He said my name twice. He said the word overreacting and then, hearing himself, corrected to misunderstanding. He mentioned the years we'd been married. He mentioned the house. He said at some point that he thought I would have come to him first before doing anything legal, that he deserved that much. I waited until he was finished. I said, "You had 11 weeks to come to me first." The line went quiet. I stood up from the table. I walked to the kitchen window. The late afternoon light was coming through at the low September angle that makes everything gold and a little sad, and the street outside was empty and the neighbor's maple tree had already started to turn. I said, "You should call Arthur Finch. His number is on the papers you'll be served with." He said, "Diane." I said, "I have to go check on my mother." I ended the call. I set the phone on the counter next to the cast iron skillet and I stood there for a moment in the kitchen light. Then I went to check on my mother. Some things don't need a final dramatic word. The truth has already been spoken. Everything after it is just sound. She died on a November morning, my mother, a Thursday, the 13th. I was there. Vivian was there. Thomas Grady, who had become a familiar presence over the intervening weeks, was there, and he was exactly as steady and unhurried in that moment as he had been in every other. The hospice volunteers came and went like tides. Everything that needed to be done was done. I stayed in Chattanooga for 3 more weeks after, handling the particulars the way she would have handled them, completely and without complaint and in the order they needed to be done. I wore the pearl brooch from her jewelry box at the service because she didn't have one and I needed something of hers that close. I wore it the way she would have worn it, straight at the left lapel, without apology. I drove back to Birchwood Terrace on a Thursday in early December. My house. Mine on paper now, and mine in the older sense that the papers were trying to catch up to, the sense in which a place belongs to the person who has kept it, tended it, known where every document is and every bill is paid and every lamp needs a new bulb. I had Arthur Finch's process underway. The settlement would take months, as these things do. I was prepared for months. I had been prepared for longer. But I understood, sitting in my own kitchen that first night back, with the lamp on and the cast iron skillet on the back left burner where it had lived since I brought it home from her apartment, seasoned the color of midnight, needing nothing, was something I could not have articulated while I was still inside the marriage, because you cannot see the shape of a container from the inside. I had given Douglas 11 years of the same thing my mother had given me 61 years of, the daily, unglamorous, unremarked practice of showing up. The difference was that she had aimed it at someone who understood what it was. I had aimed it at someone who mistook it for furniture, something permanent and functional that requires no tending and will always be there when you get home. My mother never made that mistake. She looked at what was actually present and she responded to that, not the projected version, the actual one, and she knew years before I did that Douglas Mercer was not someone who showed up not for her in the hospital or the treatment center or the hard months. Not for me, not for anyone unless he specifically wanted something from them. She never said it. But I had been her daughter for 61 years, and I knew what she thought the way you know a recipe you've watched made 1,000 times in your body before you could name it. The knitting was in my bag by the door, the cream wool blanket, the one she'd fixed in the hospital room. I'd brought it home because it was the last thing her hands had worked on and I couldn't bring the skillet twice. I put the kettle on. I got the chamomile from the cabinet. I'd bought a new tin while I was in Chattanooga, the same blue tin she kept by her stove, and I measured out 1 spoonful and then 1 more because the second one is for warmth. Outside, the December air was cold and clear, and the streetlight on Birchwood Terrace made the frozen front walk shine. The maple next door had lost all its leaves. The night was very still. I drank my tea in the kitchen with the lamp on, the skillet on its burner, the knitting by the door. I knew exactly what I was worth. She'd always told me, if this story stayed with you, join our community, subscribe, like. Share it with someone who deserves to hear it. Some people spend their whole lives making withdrawals from relationships they never bothered to deposit into. I will see you on the next one.